Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted you joined us for today's MTI Research Snap webinar, Free Transit, It All Depends on How. This is the third in our four-part series on advancing transportation equity. And we're exploring transportation equity as we reflect on some of the most pressing challenges in our industry. My name's Dr. Karen Philbrick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mineta Transportation Institute at San Jose State University. At MTI, we lead three competitively selected multi-university consortia. The Mineta Consortium for Transportation Mobility, funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation. The California State University Transportation Consortium, funded by California Senate Bill 1, which is officially known as the Road Repair and Accountability Act of 2017. And finally, the Climate Change and Extreme Events Training and Research Program, funded by the Federal Railroad Administration. All of our work focuses on improving the mobility of people and goods, and our mission is to increase the safety, accessibility, convenience, and affordability of our nation's transportation systems. As you will learn in today's webinar, free or fareless transit is presented as part of a solution to multiple problems: low ridership, growing income inequality, racial discrimination, and even climate change. But we all know that it's wholly unrealistic to think that any one tool in the toolbox can solve all of our problems. So we are looking forward to hearing from our expert presenters today as they talk about the ideas behind free transit and how it can be combined with other policies so that there's fair service to all communities and all members of our society. Because after all, transportation is the backbone of our economy, and where people are concerned, the difference between having and lacking access to mobility is no different than having and lacking access to opportunity. So our speakers today are Dr. Joshua Shank and Emma Huang. Joshua is a research associate with the Mineta Transportation Institute and a managing principal at InfraStrategies. Prior to his current role, he was the Chief Innovation Officer at LA Metro, the president and CEO of the Eno Center for Transportation, and very importantly, a transportation policy advisor to Senator Hillary Clinton. We also have Emma Huang, who's a senior consultant with InfraStrategies as well, and she comes from LA Metro, where she served as a transportation planner in the Office of Extraordinary Innovation. Joshua and Emma, thank you so much for being with us today. And for our viewing public, we're going to do a slight pivot. We had so many questions submitted at the time of registration that our presenters are going to condense their formal comments so they can really address all of your greatest questions and concerns. And to that end, if other questions strike you during the presentation, please drop them into the chat feature or the Q&A feature. This will be recorded and available later today, along with the slides and a link to the publication. Joshua and Emma, I give you the floor.
Well, thanks so much, Karen. We're so glad to be here and be able to talk about this really critical issue. If you want to move to the next slide. The background we want to provide here before we get into some of the ideas that we've suggested. The reason that we want to talk about this, in addition to the things that Karen mentioned, is that this is obviously a hot topic. People have been talking about it. It's something that many transit agencies are considering, especially coming out of the pandemic. This was something that we put forward as an idea when I was with the Office of Extraordinary Innovation, and it did gain some traction at LA Metro, but eventually did not become a reality as yet, but still something that's being talked about quite a lot here in Los Angeles, especially with a new mayor who has included it as part of her platform. The thing that we've been seeing, though, is that it's a great idea in principle, and it's something that a lot of elected officials like to talk about, but there is often a mismatch between the rhetoric around the concept of fareless transit and the potential outcomes. For example, we see a lot of elected officials saying, oh, this is a fareless policy. I'm in favor of that because it's the best way for us to promote equity. Well, it can be a way to promote equity, but how you do it will determine how effectively you use it to promote equity. So it's not necessarily as simple as just, well, we put in free transit and that improves X, Y, and Z outcomes. How you do it really matters. And so we're suggesting some strategies for how you might capture the benefits of free transit most effectively, rather than just thinking of it as a pure standalone policy in and of its own right. It typically needs to be coupled with other changes, or thought about in a creative manner to achieve the outcomes that you're looking for. And that's why this fourth bullet here is so critical. This is something that we often said to ourselves and to others at LA Metro during our time there, which you always have to think about what you're actually trying to achieve with any given policy in order to create a policy that achieves that goal. It's very easy to say, I'm in favor of free transit because I care about equity or environment or ridership. But being specific about which thing you really care about and prioritizing that will shape what the actual fareless policy looks like. And so I'm going to turn now to Emma to get into some of the ideas that we threw out there.
Thanks, Joshua. We can go to the next slide. So the first strategy that we explored in our paper was off-peak fareless transit. And so if your goal is to help low-income people, but you are very sensitive to your revenue sources, keeping fares in place during peak times and then charging no fares during off-peak hours is a potential strategy. And the rationale behind this is that it's an easy to understand fare policy that still allows agencies to collect some amount of revenue from their peak hour customers while extending a benefit to those who travel during off-peak hours. And we know that low-income people ride more during off-peak times. And so this would also eliminate the need for any burdensome means testing, and it would make sense to keep turnstiles and fare payment technology, which could act as a deterrent or a signal to those from wandering onto an open system. A second strategy that we explored is around if your goal is to increase transit ridership and improve equity, a strategy could be to combine fareless transit with road pricing, where you're charging drivers to drive at peak times. And so in order to be able to afford providing fareless transit long-term, you need an ongoing sustainable funding source. But also if you want to increase transit ridership meaningfully, going fareless on its own is not likely to do that. You would also need to raise the cost of driving in order to reverse the incentives that encourage driving over taking transit. And this would lead to improved congestion, which would benefit both those taking transit and driving. And then lastly, if your goal is to improve equity by reducing the cost of transportation for low-income individuals, offering fareless transit on its own might not be the best way to address this if your transit system is not effective, because even if you're eliminating the fare, if your system is too slow or inconvenient, or it doesn't go where you need it to go, low-income individuals are still paying with their time. And so a better way to address these inequities would be to provide a mobility subsidy to low-income individuals that is not limited to using on transit. And so this is the idea of universal basic mobility, where low-income individuals can get funds to spend on a variety of different transportation options, including transit, but also rideshare, bikes, scooters, etc. And so the idea here is to provide a maximum flexibility in mobility options for those that need them the most. And to our earlier point, packaging fareless transit with other policy decisions is can address some of our societal challenges, but it really depends on first determining the goals that you're trying to achieve.
Does that conclude your formal remarks?
It does, yeah, very short.
Okay, great. I love it. Now we'll get right into those questions. I do realize that in your formal comments, you did touch on some of the responses to these questions, but I'd like everybody to know that we heard you, we are asking them, and we are listening for maybe a more in-depth response. So let's get started with the first one. One of the major pushbacks against free transit is the question of funding, obviously. How can we ensure that fare-free programs remain fiscally sustainable over the long term?
Yeah, and I think that question, it depends a lot on which transit agency you're talking about, because there's obviously tremendous variation between how different transit agencies, how much they rely on fare box revenue to support their operations or other needs. But in general, most U.S. transit agencies are actually kind of like LA Metro in the sense that a lot of their budget is not coming from fares, and fares are a pretty small amount of their overall budget package. And if that's the case, the question to ask is, well, what are you spending things on? We're spending money on for fare-related things that you might not need to spend money on. Right? For example, Metro spends a substantial amount of money on fare collection, fare enforcement.
Mhm.
Are those things required? Do you need to spend the money on those things? And if you took those away and took away fares, would you potentially break even? That's one way to start. Another way to think about it is if you have a budget that is heavily weighted towards capital investment, which certainly LA Metro does and some other agencies do as well, do you need to have that much money invested in future capital? Or is there perhaps a greater need to deal with equity and ridership issues right now? And might that be a way to reprioritize how you're investing your money, thinking about, well, let's really help the people who need transit right now. That might be more important than this, for example, legacy rail project that we're putting in because someone in power wants it and wants to cut a ribbon. So those are reasonable questions to ask when you're thinking about the budget for fareless.
So I have one comment and one follow-up question. You talked about fare enforcement and fare collection, and I realized that in looking at industry and transit operator assault, some of that friction and conflict comes over the fare enforcement piece.
Yeah.
Can you say anything more about that?
Yeah, that is actually something we looked at while we were at Metro, because there is the possibility, beyond obviously reducing assaults on operators, which is an issue, and we did find that a substantial number of over 50% of the assaults that were occurring with operators were fare-related discussions. So, yeah. So if that's the case, even though operators are instructed at Metro, at least, not to enforce the fares beyond saying the fare is $1.75, there's no other instruction beyond that, but they feel obligated often, and they want to enforce the fare. And so that is the source of many altercations. Beyond wanting to reduce operator assaults, which is obviously important, there is a cost in terms of insurance and other associated costs that happen when you have a substantial number of operator assaults. So yeah, that's a good point. Another number to keep in mind when you're thinking about the overall budget here.
Not to mention the human psychological toll that assault carries along with it. And then my follow-up question, when you talked about the ribbon cutter, and how maybe funding should be spent prioritizing the riders versus a capital project. What about restrictions on the source of that funding and how it might have been written into law? How do you get beyond that?
Yeah, this is something we looked at when we were leading the recovery task force at Metro, because oftentimes people will say, well, you can't spend that money on this because it's already written into law that you have to. And sometimes that's true. But we always took that with a little bit of a grain of salt, because people will often cite laws and regulations that they think can't be changed under any circumstances as a reason for doing something. But when you probe a little deeper, sometimes you find that changing them isn't that difficult. In fact, at Metro, when we probed into that issue, we found that if the board agreed to it, that could be done. And it could be done in a way that would potentially move towards universal basic mobility, as we talked about. So my suggestion is, when people tell you that you can't do it, don't accept that answer. Do your research and find out whether that's true.
I think that's excellent advice, regardless of what the topic is. Let's be honest. All right, let's jump to our next question. There are already fare-free transit pilot programs here and in other communities. What are some unexpected benefits and impacts that these programs have had so far?
Emma, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can speak to some of them. I think some of the pilots that we looked at, and when we at Metro went fareless essentially during the pandemic, some of the unexpected outcomes were more on the operational side, where it just wasn't taking as long to load the bus. And so buses were able to not be dwelling for as long. They're not loading for as long. It's faster for people to get on the bus. And so there's an operational benefit to that. We talked a little bit about the benefit of the operator not having to have a potentially contentious conversation with someone to quote the fare. I think also just like the ease of it, where you're no longer having to understand like the 600 plus fares that Metro or other systems have, and you're just able to get on and go. So it's almost like kind of the same seamless benefit that we're seeing now with just tapping onto the system with, Apple Pay or other fare integrations, where it's essentially like that. So I think there is a user experience benefit as well that's not talked about as often.
So it becomes more seamless with a more integrated policy in some cases. Instead of trying to figure out all of those multiple payment systems, it's more efficient because the rider just gets on and doesn't have to deal with that headache in some ways.
Yes.
Very interesting. Now, we've got to talk about the unhoused population and people who are non-destination riders who may use a bus service, a light rail, or a subway as a form of temporary housing or at least shelter. How do you balance that with fare-free transit and what might become of it?
Yeah, I think I'll be a typical kind of academic here and answer a question with a question, which is to say, is charging fares to low-income people our best strategy for dealing with homelessness? There's going to be homeless people on public transit as long as you have a homeless problem in your society. And asking transit to solve that problem by charging fares to the lowest income people in society seems a little backwards to me. The homelessness issue is something that transit certainly cannot solve by itself. And I think the marginal benefit of charging fares with respect to reducing homeless people on trains and buses does nothing to actually address the homeless problem, right? What it does is that it might help improve the customer experience slightly, but that's only if fares are the only mechanism by which you can conceive to keep your buses and trains in order. And I think that there are lots of other strategies that are worth exploring besides fare collection that can provide a better environment for people on public transit. And that includes things like what LA Metro is experimenting with right now, which is this ambassador program, where they've got people riding trains and buses whose job it is to act as ambassadors for the system and greet people and talk to them and be a presence on the system. That can be a real positive customer experience benefit. So I think we get confused with these two different issues, right? There's one issue, which is, should we charge some of the lowest income people in society to ride transit, which is in LA's case, almost everyone who's riding transit is low income, versus should we deal with the customer experience and try to make riding buses and trains as pleasant as possible? We should obviously do both of those things, but we shouldn't confuse them and act as if they're one and the same.
That's a terrific distinction, and I very much appreciated that academic response. We do have 5 questions that have been dropped into the feature, so pardon me, I'm going to read these verbatim. How does this make an already expensive paratransit system sustainable?
You want to take a shot at this, Emma?
I think so. If I understand the question, it's that there's obligations for how much transit agencies charge. There's requirements when they are charging for transit. And so the idea is, well, if we're going fareless for our fixed route service, how do we handle that for our paratransit? And I mean, I think that's a valid point. And I think that there is a lot of concern from paratransit operators about how they're going to replace revenue sources, what the implications are for fares. But I think needing to, I guess, identify new potential revenue sources is something that we've talked about in the paper. Is that you probably don't want to pursue this policy without first identifying that revenue source. And then also, I think there are kind of emerging models for paratransit being explored right now for cost savings and things like that. But Josh, I don't know if you want to weigh in.
I mean, the only thing I would add is, again, if we as a society believe that we should be providing paratransit services for those who need them, and I absolutely would think most people on this webinar would agree that's something as a society we should be doing. Now we're just talking about how do we pay for it. And if the idea that the only way that we can pay for this is by reducing demand and putting out a fare that keeps demand down and charges the people who need this service for it. The idea that that's the only way to provide the service, I just don't buy it. There's got to be other ways to raise the revenue for such a critical service for society. And we did name a couple of them, congestion pricing, road pricing being one of the most obvious ways to do it. But you can come up with many different resources. The question is, why should transit customers be burdened with that? Why should paratransit customers be burdened with that? And I can't really think of a good argument for why they should be.
Mm-hmm. You know, that kind of leads to the next question, but you mentioned congestion pricing. I know there have been some global best practices of how the introduction of this, if you have a set amount going to transit, increases ridership and other such positive outcomes. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking for a policy that accomplishes most of what transit intends to accomplish, road pricing is basically it, right? Well, what have transit agencies been struggling with? They're struggling with low ridership. They're struggling with lack of operating funds. They're struggling with the fact that cars are a formidable competitor that it's almost impossible for transit to beat in most cases. Well, road pricing kind of deals with all three of those things pretty easily and pretty handily. In the places where we've seen road pricing implemented in London and Stockholm and Singapore, we've not just seen transit increase, we've seen increases in almost every form of non-single occupancy vehicle mobility, movement, including bicycling and pedestrian, land use changes, carpooling. There's so many great benefits, and I'm not blind to the fact that this is a difficult policy to implement. We were trying for years at LA Metro, and we didn't necessarily get that far. But it is such a powerful potential policy, and can be combined with free transit to create a society that I think is much more equitable and reduces emissions and reduces congestion and all those great benefits. But it's definitely worth exploring where it's possible.
Agreed. And so this other question, and I know you touched on the fact that fare box recovery doesn't really fund most of the system, but a very specific question is, how would the production of buses, the compensation for bus drivers, and the cost of gas be funded if you move to a fareless transit program? Where would you get the money to fund everything if you have no fares coming in short what the question is.
Well, I think if you look at even everything from small, like rural transit agencies to really large ones, they typically have a kind of package for how they're funding their operations and maintenance. And we always recommend like not just to rely on one source. Mm-hmm. And to Joshua's point about seeing fare box recovery go down over time, they're making it up in other ways, whether that's local sales tax options, whether that's property taxes. There's, I think, a lot of creative ways to address that funding gap. And even outside of the question about how to fund fareless, I think the industry is facing these kind of bigger questions for how to fund transit in the future. And so we're not advocating, and we wouldn't advocate for anyone to just pursue fareless on its own and doing business as usual. It's going to require these bigger questions about funding. And so that might entail really big decisions like, do we want to pursue something like congestion pricing? Do we want to pursue some sort of property tax measure, some ballot measure? There's a lot of ways you can fund transit.
Great answer. Thank you for that, Emma. What's the first step to close the gap between political leaders advocating for free transit and moving to implement it in their communities? So you've got the ribbon cutters who want to have this program, but how does it move from that concept to implementation?
Well, I like the model, and again, New York hasn't quite gotten there, but I like the model for how New York got over some big hurdles for congestion pricing, which is there were specific groups that came together to advocate on behalf of riders of the transit system in New York, and went out and literally protested in front of the members of the assembly who were opposing congestion pricing and saying, look, by opposing congestion pricing, you're hurting low-income people. You are taking away a source of funding for transit that we need and that we rely on. And I like that strategy because I feel like so often elected officials who profess to be in favor of improving equity and want to be the heroes who are helping low-income people, then go out and promote policies that do exactly the opposite. And this is a great example of that. I mean, you can say that you care about low-income people who ride transit, but if you're not willing to stand up and say, well, we need protected bus and bike lanes, and we need congestion pricing, and we need these really challenging things that are going to anger a lot of people who do have power and money, then you're not really standing up for low-income people. And so this is, if you want to get to implementation, you have to call out the elected officials, maybe by using a smart think tank type organization such as Mineta or other researchers who can really kind of come up with the data to provide evidence for that assertion, that if you really care about equity, here are the policies you need to follow. And if otherwise, you're just blowing smoke.
That's so interesting, because in the narrative you just shared, there was a power in the story that you told. I could visualize that low income rider and see how the policies, that if you say you're for that, you really need to support policies on a different level to be able to afford that reality you wish to see. So the power of storytelling is even important in this conversation, it seems. How can we assure that data is collected accurately and the information put into practice to ensure fare free transit benefits those who need it most? How are we going to get that data to know a fare free program is working, it's increasing ridership, and it's addressing some of those plurality of concerns you mentioned previously in your comments?
I mean, I think there's a lot of pilot programs right now that have started to look at fareless or have some form of it, whether it's the full system or just for a certain kind of age range. And I really think that the opportunity and the importance is studying those pilots and seeing what the benefits have been, what the challenges have been, and really kind of documenting that and publicizing it to the industry. I think there's a lot of curious people that have their eyes on certain pilots and are looking and are hungry for information that can help them understand how that system has operated and all of that. So I think hopefully having resources towards documenting those lessons learned from the agency is something that they're prioritizing so that the rest of the industry can learn from them.
You mentioned that there's a number of such programs in existence. Is there one that stands out for you as sort of a best practice to be emulated, or one that has positive data to share?
I mean, I know that KCATA has a fareless program right now, and they probably have had it for the longest. But with regards to if it's been properly, documented and whether they have a study of it, I'm not sure. But that would be something I would be excited to look at.
They have had some initial data, though, that indicates, and this again goes back to the issue of what outcomes you're trying to achieve, that there's been no noticeable decline in safety or anything like that. So when that's cited as an issue, that's at least some data that's coming out that shows probably not much of an issue.
I think that's incredibly important, that point that you just made. Certainly, as we listen to the fear-mongering in the media and some of the truly devastating accounts of assault, not only on operators, but on passengers as well. So thank you for stressing that. And I'm sorry to say that with that, our time has come to a close. For the listening audience, as mentioned previously, a link to the final report, the slides, and the video of today's webinar will be disseminated widely. You can also access the final report from the link that was dropped previously into the chat feature. We thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you at our fourth integration of this series, which will be on February 28th at 12:30 p.m. And that will be looking at advancing transportation equity through the Voices of Impact, which is a partnership between the California Planning Association and the Mineta Transportation Institute, where the unique voices of 6 underrepresented minorities are amplified to learn of some of the challenges they've experienced and how we can overcome such challenges in the future. Thank you to all for joining us. Joshua and Emma, we're grateful for your time and expertise. We wish you all a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yay.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.